The story of Lot and his daughters. This is one of the stories that is literally one of the creepiest and wildest in the Bible. Like, you won't believe it. Seriously, you'd expect a story like this in some dark ancient book, not the Bible. But here it is, written down in detail, full of twists and shocking moments you wouldn't expect. Some of it honestly doesn't suit a young audience. It's too wild for Sunday school. So, let's get into it. This is from Genesis chapter 19, and it happens right when the city of Sodom was about to be destroyed. Now, you need to understand the setting. Sodom was famous for being wicked, so wicked that God decided to wipe it out. To warn Lot, 2 angels came down, but they looked just like young men. Lot, being trained by Abraham, knew how important hospitality was, so he immediately invited them in and insisted they stay at his house. That part sounds nice, right? But then, here's the crazy part. In Genesis 19:4-5, the men of the city surrounded Lot's house and shouted for him to bring out the visitors. And no, they weren't just asking to shake hands. The text makes it clear they wanted to do unspeakable things to them. That's how messed up Sodom was. And Lot, the so-called righteous man, steps outside and begs them not to harm his guests. Good so far. But then, in verse 8, he offers his 2 daughters instead. His own daughters. Like, don't touch these men. But here, take my daughters instead, and do whatever you want to them instead of my guests. Can you even imagine? Thankfully, the angels intervene. They pull Lot back inside, strike the mob with blindness, and order him to leave the city before God rains down destruction. That's when Lot's wife looks back in verse 26, ignoring the warning, and instantly turns into a pillar of salt. You'd think that was the ending. But nope, it gets even darker. In verses 30-36, Lot and his daughters escape to a cave. Believing they're the last people alive, the daughters get their father drunk and each one sleeps with him. Both become pregnant, and their children go on to become the ancestors of the nations of Moab and Ammon. So, yep, out of fire, salt, blindness, and a cave, you get one of the strangest family stories in the Bible. And the next story we're about to talk about is just as unbelievable. The story of Judah and Tamar. This next story comes out of Genesis chapter 38, and yeah, it's also one of those Bible stories you never hear in Sunday school, probably because it's a little too wild to tell kids. So, Judah. You've probably heard of him as one of Jacob's 12 sons, the ancestor of King David, and the namesake of the Jewish people. Pretty big deal, right? He's remembered as noble and brave, especially later, when he offers himself in Benjamin's place during the Joseph story. But before all that, there's this one story that shows a very different side of him. Judah had 3 sons, Onan, and Shelah. He arranged a marriage between his oldest son, and a woman named Tamar. Genesis 38:7 says was wicked in the Lord's sight, and just like that, he died. Now comes the ancient law of levirate marriage. If a man dies childless, his brother is supposed to marry the widow and continue the family line. So Tamar was given to Onan, the second son. But Onan didn't want to father children who would be considered his brothers. Verse 9 says he spilled his seed on the ground instead. God wasn't pleased with that, and Onan also died. At this point, Judah was nervous. 2 sons gone, 1 widow still around. He told Tamar to wait until Shelah, the youngest, grew up. But when Shelah came of age, Judah never followed through. Tamar was left waiting, stuck without justice. So Tamar came up with a bold plan. She disguised herself with a veil, and when Judah was traveling after his own wife had died, he mistook her for a prostitute. He promised to send her a young goat as payment, but as a guarantee, she asked for his signet, cloak, and staff. He agreed, slept with her, and went on his way. Later, when he tried to send the goat, she was nowhere to be found. 3 months later, Tamar turned up pregnant. People accused her of immorality, and Judah, without knowing the truth, ordered her execution. But then Tamar revealed the items Judah had given her. In Genesis 38:26, Judah admits, "She is more righteous than I, since I wouldn't give her to my son Shelah." Tamar gave birth to twins, Peretz and Zerah, and Peretz became an ancestor of King David. Imagine that. The whole royal line comes from this messy, almost scandalous situation. It's a story about hypocrisy, justice, and how even the most flawed people can end up shaping history. Moving forward to the next Bible story, which is literally more shocking than this one, the story of the concubine in Gibeah. This story is from Judges chapter 19. It is quite disturbing, shocking, and honestly feels like it belongs in a horror movie rather than the Bible. You've probably never heard it in Sunday school, and in a while, you'll understand why. So here's what happens. A man and his concubine are traveling, and they decide to spend the night in the city of Gibeah, which was part of the tribe of Benjamin. Now, here's the detail that really stings. They had actually avoided stopping in Jebus, the future Jerusalem, because they thought, Those people aren't Israelites, they might treat us badly. Instead, they trusted their own people in Giva. Big mistake. At first, no one even offers them a place to stay. Finally, an old man sees them waiting in the street and takes them in. Problem solved, right? Not even close. Judges 19:22 says the men of the city surrounded the house and demanded the guest be handed over to them. Sound familiar? Yeah, it feels exactly like the story of Sodom, except this time it's not some wicked foreign city, it's an Israelite town. That's what makes this so shocking. The old man tries to protect his guest, but the solution he offers is horrifying. He says, "Don't touch this man. Here, take my virgin daughter and his concubine instead." Why is this even a thing? Why do these stories keep putting women in this awful spot? But before there's even time to argue, the concubine gets thrown outside to the mob. By morning, she's lying dead at the doorstep. And here's where the story goes from tragedy to nightmare. The man takes her body, cuts it into 12 pieces, and sends one piece to each tribe of Israel. He wanted the whole nation to see how sick this crime was. The tribes are horrified and they declare war on the tribe of Benjamin. The civil war is so intense that the tribe is almost wiped out. Later, the people come up with strange solutions for how Benjamin can survive, which ties into the festival of Tu B'Av, what's called the Holiday of Love. Kinda wild, right? Because this whole story will make you think twice about calling the Bible family-friendly. The story of Amnon and Tamar. Yeah. You might have noticed, women named Tamar don't exactly get happy endings in the Bible. This story comes from 2 Samuel chapter 13, and it's honestly one of the most disturbing stories in King David's family. You probably know the famous scandal with David and Bathsheba. Well, this is part of the fallout. God told David that because of his sin, his house would be filled with trouble. And here you really see it. So Amnon, David's oldest son, develops an obsession with his half-sister Tamar. Instead of shutting those thoughts down, he actually tells his cousin, Yonadav, about it. Now, you'd hope Yonadav would say, "That's your sister." That's wrong. Move on. But nope. Instead, in verse 5, Yonadav gives him a twisted plan. Pretend to be sick, and when King David comes to check on you, ask him to send Tamar to cook food and feed you. And Amnon follows through. He lies down, fakes being ill, and David unknowingly sends Tamar to take care of him. She makes him bread right in front of him, and when she comes close to serve it, verse 11 says Amnon grabs her and says, "Come, lie with me." Tamar begs him not to do it. She pleads, saying, "Don't, my brother. Such a thing should not be done in Israel." But Amnon ignores her. He forces himself on her. And right after, the same man who thought he loved her suddenly hates her. Verse 15 says he hated her with a hatred greater than the love he had felt. He throws her out, humiliating her even more. Tamar is devastated, and her brother Absalom takes her in. But he doesn't forget what happened. 2 years later, Absalom gets his revenge. He kills Amnon. And that murder sparks a chain of events that ends with Absalom rebelling against his own father, King David. So yeah, this single act of violence against Tamar doesn't just destroy her life, it tears apart the royal family and almost topples the kingdom. A sermon so dull a man died. This story comes from Acts 27-12, and it's one of those Bible moments that makes you do a double take. We all know Paul, the man who went from hunting Christians to becoming one of the most important figures of the New Testament. But here's a story about him you probably didn't hear in Sunday school. So Paul is in Troas, and he's preaching. Now, Paul isn't giving a quick 10-minute talk. According to Acts 27, he starts speaking in the evening and just keeps going, and going, because he knows he's leaving the next day. By the time it's midnight, he's still preaching. You can imagine the room, lamps burning, people packed in, and Paul talking on and on. Now in there we have a young man named Eutychus sitting in the window, and like probably half of us would do, he starts nodding off. Verse 9 literally says, "As Paul talked on and on, Eutychus sank into a deep sleep." Relatable, right? But here's where it takes a shocking turn. Eutychus isn't just snoozing in a pew, he's perched on a third-story window. He falls asleep, loses his balance, and tumbles straight down to the ground. When people rush over, the text says he was picked up dead. Imagine the room. 1 minute Paul is preaching. The next, someone yells that the kid in the window just died. That has to be the most awkward sermon interruption of all time. But Paul doesn't panic. He runs downstairs, throws himself on the boy, and says, "Don't be alarmed, he's alive." And sure enough, Eutychus comes back to life. The crowd is shocked, but also overjoyed. And then they go right back upstairs, eat some food, and Paul continues talking until daylight. The guy literally finished his sermon after raising someone from the dead. So yes, Paul once preached so long that someone died from boredom, but then he turned it into a resurrection miracle. The fire story. This story is from Daniel chapter 3, and it's basically one of the most famous Old Testament stories, but also one of the strangest when you think about the details. So, King Nebuchadnezzar, yep, quite the name, decided to build a giant gold statue of himself, not just big, but 60 cubits tall, which is about 27 meters. Then he made a law. Whenever music played, everybody had to bow down and worship the statue. If you didn't, you'd be thrown into a blazing furnace. Now, if you're Jewish, that's a serious problem. Bowing to idols breaks the first two commandments. 3 young Jewish men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, refused. They were dragged in front of the king, who told them in verse 15, "If you don't worship, you'll be thrown into the furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" Their reply is one of the boldest in the Bible. In verses 16 to 18, they say, "Our God can save us. But even if he doesn't, we will not bow." Nebuchadnezzar doesn't take rejection well. He orders the furnace to be heated 7 times hotter than usual, which, if you think about it, makes no sense. A furnace is already deadly. Making it hotter just kills you faster, right? But that's what he does. It gets so hot that the soldiers who throw them in actually burn to death. But then comes the twist. The king looks inside the fire and sees not 3 men, but 4. And in verse 25, he says, "The 4th looks like a son of the gods." Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are walking around untouched. No ropes, no burns. When they step out, verse 27 says, not even a hair is singed, their clothes aren't scorched, and they don't even smell like smoke. Nebuchadnezzar is stunned. He immediately declares their God the Most High God. But in true Nebuchadnezzar fashion, his new punishment makes no sense either. Anyone who refuses will be cut to pieces and have their houses torn down. I mean, if I've already been chopped into pieces, the state of my house is the least of my worries. The story of Zombie. This is from 2 Kings 13:20 to 21, and after hearing it, you will agree that it's one of the weirdest miracle stories in the Bible. You've probably heard of Elijah, the prophet who went up to heaven in a fiery chariot, but his successor, Elisha, had plenty of miracles too. And this one? It happened after he was already dead. So here's the setup. The Israelites were living through a rough time, constantly under threat from raiders and enemy armies. One day, some men were out in the countryside, getting ready to bury their friend. A sad, ordinary moment, except it was about to get very unordinary. While they were preparing the body, a group of Moabite raiders suddenly appeared. Panic sets in. They don't have time to finish the burial, so they do the quickest thing they can think of. They toss the body into the nearest tomb. Now, this wasn't just any tomb. It was the resting place of the prophet Elisha, who by this time had been dead and buried. Verse 21 says that as soon as the man's body touched Elisha's bones, something incredible happened. The man came back to life and stood on his feet. Imagine that moment. 1 second you're running from raiders, tossing your friend's body into a grave just to save yourself, and the next second that friend is literally standing up and running alongside you. Talk about shock value. This miracle doesn't involve Elisha speaking, praying, or even being alive. The power of God worked through his bones, long after he was gone. It's like even in death, Elisha's role as prophet wasn't finished. It's a tiny story, just 2 verses tucked into 2 Kings 13, but it leaves such a big impression. It shows how unpredictable, even surprising the Bible can be. People expect miracles from prophets while they're alive, but a miracle from a prophet's skeleton? That's something else entirely. The story of strange advice. Now, all of you would agree that the Bible is full of good advice, right? Love your neighbor. Treat others the way you want to be treated. Turn the other cheek. Those are the kind of verses you expect to hear in a sermon, but every once in a while you stumble across something that makes you go, wait, what? Take the prophet Hosea. His story kicks off in Hosea 1:2, and it's not exactly the advice you'd want your kid to follow. God speaks to him and says, "Go, marry a promiscuous woman and have children with her, for like an adulterous wife, this land is guilty of unfaithfulness to the Lord." So what does Hosea do? He obeys. He goes out, marries a woman named Gomer. Yes, Gomer, not exactly the most romantic-sounding name, and they have 3 children together. And the names of these kids are not exactly the kind you'd find on a baby name list. The first is Jezreel, named after a valley where a bloody massacre took place. The second is Lo Ruhamah, which literally means not loved. And the third, Lo Ami, meaning not my people. Imagine calling your kid in for dinner like that. Hey, not loved, wash your hands before you eat. Now, some people read this literally. Hosea really did marry Gomer, and their marriage was a living illustration of God's relationship with Israel. Just as Gomer was unfaithful to Hosea, the people were unfaithful to God. Others think it's all allegory, that Gomer wasn't an actual person, but a metaphor written into the story. Either way, the point is the same. Hosea's messy marriage is used as a picture of God's love. Even though his people are unfaithful, God remains loyal. Some Christian commentators even see this as a foreshadowing of Jesus, Hosea as the faithful husband, and Gomer representing the church or humanity. And these were some of the Bible's strangest, wildest, and most unexpected stories. Stuff you'd never hear in Sunday school, but it's all right there in the text. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to stick around, because there is a lot of content that we are going to post regularly, and there is much in the Bible that you need to know. We've only just scratched the surface, so see you in the next video.